let's get started. Welcome. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. I am excited to present you today's event, Back to the Future of Automotive Powertrain, 1.21 gigawatts. Are we there yet? A collaboration between the ACG chapters from Silicon Valley and Detroit. Both of our chapters are offering a variety of virtual events in the coming months. We invite you to visit our websites to see the full calendars. Before we begin, we have a few quick housekeeping items to mention. After our panel discussion, we will have a Q&A session. Please submit your questions through the chat box. We will also be recording today's program. After the event, you will receive an email with a link in case you would like to rewatch or share it with your colleagues. Of course, I would like to thank the companies who serve as sponsors for our various chapters. Without them, nothing we do would be possible. So thank you. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our moderator today, Gary Silberg. Gary is the KPMG's LLP's National Industry Lead Partner for the Automotive, as well as the Global Lead Partner for Ford Motor Company. With 25 plus years of business experience, including over 15 years in the automotive industry, he advises numerous domestic and multinational companies in areas of strategy, mergers and acquisitions, and joint ventures. For the past 6 years, he has focused on the intersection of technology and the automotive industry with groundbreaking research on self-driving cars, connectivity, and mobility on-demand services. He has written extensively about the auto industry. Gary?
Well, thank you, Yvonne, and a big good morning to everybody. This is really a terrific topic, and I will introduce my esteemed colleagues on a panel. We're going to talk about the future of powertrain. But before I do that, I want to do a little framing. We've recently announced, for those of you who are not aware, KPMG, myself, and my awesome automotive team had announced a new paper. It's titled, Place Your Billion-Dollar Bets Wisely. It's the future of automotive powertrains. And I want to ground our discussion. I'm going to do this in a Zoom environment in 5 minutes or less, but I'm going to frame the big, we think are the big ideas and the big issues to this new world of powertrain. And then I'm going to open it up to my esteemed colleagues and panelists to have a robust and fun, and I'm sure will be insightful discussion. So with that, let me try to share my screen here. Let's see if I've got this. Go share. Can you guys tell me if you can see that? Are we good to go?
Yep, you can see it.
You can see it. Okay, let me start.
Yes.
All right, I will, 1 second here. So here we go. So the paper, and you're very welcome to obviously Google it and take a look, but it is, the punchline I'll get to the paper is the century-long reign of the internal combustion engine is ending. We think there's no doubt. But what we'll replace it, and what we're going to talk about on this podcast, I'll call it webcast, is an industry that will look way more complex than conventional wisdom thinks. There's going to be probably, at least in the near term, too many players chasing too few consumers. There's going to be a shakeout. You're going to see massive overcapacity in the internal combustion engine area, which, by the way, is not going away. There's a lot of unanswered infrastructure questions, and there's going to be structural change within the industry. And so mark my words, the stakes could not be higher and the bets could not be bigger. So hence, place your billion-dollar bets wisely. So here's a quick rundown of some data for you. You all know the story of Tesla, how it's changed the world. People didn't believe them for many years. They were laughed at, they were ignored. They were, I won't even give the adjectives I've heard, and yet they cracked the ice, as we say metaphorically. And there has been a plethora of announcements that have occurred subsequent to this great story. What has occurred? There has been over $200 billion, I repeat, $200 billion of announced EV investments, pure battery electric vehicles, within the last 18 months. you will see a huge amount, a bevy of beautiful, new, sexy vehicles coming out in the next years that will be available. So people are already announcing and placing billion-dollar bets. Is the conventional wisdom going to be right? Is it going to be a battery electric vehicle that will replace the ICE engine? We do not think that is the case. In fact, what will emerge is something more complex, where you're going to have battery electric vehicles, you're going to have hybrid vehicles, you're going to have hydrogen vehicles, you could even have natural gas vehicles. And I've seen, and it's in fact, it was a German company, I saw a very sexy, cool solar vehicle that I think could even have specific applications. So the world will look a lot more complex than King Ice, but it will not be one simple replacement with BEV. That means what? Here's some of the sexy, cool cars. You can see them, the Mach-E, the Hummer, ID4, the Cadillac Lyric. The Germans are putting out some pretty amazing cars. This next version, you can look at them. The Audi e-tron, the i4, the Mercedes. And yes, there are fantastic, really cool new startups, the Rivian R1T, you've got the Lucid Air, the Fisker Ocean. I could have filled the pages with these announcements with real capitalized companies, with real opportunities that they're placing these bets. The consensus, however, is how quickly this will occur. All the experts, let me tell you, they don't, humility is in order. You have variability between a BEV market of 24% by 2030, this is global, all the way up to close to 40. Think about that for a second. The auto industry fights to the death for what? 1/10 of a point of market share they'll fight to the death for. Look at the variability in this area. I think humility is in order. This curve could go much faster. It also could go much slower. And missing this is why these billion-dollar bets is very, very exciting, but very, very dangerous from a strategic perspective. And you can see it in terms of the numbers. Yes, there could be a big BEV market that's growing nicely, but look at the bottom of the chart. There could be 70 to 80% of the market or less that are not BEV vehicles. Are you going to give up that much of the market to be niche-y and only go after one? This is a real fundamental questions the industry is facing, which they haven't essentially faced in 100 years. You can look in the US market, how big it might be. You'd have to, if you were an all-in strategy, you'd almost have to multiply your existing market share, if you're around 10%, by 5 times by 2030, just to keep the number of vehicles sold that you do today. Hence these billion-dollar bets. There's massive overcapacity implied in the internal combustion engine. Close to 40 million vehicles could be implied where we have excess capacity. If you looked at today's numbers, if there was, say, a 30% global battery electric vehicle going forward, okay? Huge, right? And that's the equivalent of shutting down 200 assembly plants around the globe. And that doesn't even count the number of suppliers and the multiplier effect of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, 4. So you can see all this is going to rapidly change an industry we've never seen before like this. The pricing of these vehicles for the moment, they're all the sexy, beautiful ones that maybe everybody on this call can afford, but they're all essentially, most if not all, around the 45 to 50,000 and above. These are rich people's cars, and rich people for the moment are getting tax breaks. I'm not sure with governments out of money and debt that they're going to continue to give these breaks. So to me, there's too many players in this high-end market. As you look here, there's only 17% of the US market sold vehicles in 2020, 50,000 or above. Okay, so most of the market is well below that, and most of these vehicles are not even close to being ready to attack that market. I think they'll come, but for a while they're not going to be there, so you're going to have a shakeout in the near term. And then there's the physics of this, and of course, the grid challenge. We saw the grid shut down in the inclement weather in Texas, and California has brownouts and blackouts. And by the way, just to put that in perspective, Texas and California by themselves are some of the richest, quote unquote, economies in the entire world. If this is what happens in rich economies, think what happens in the poor economies in the world. There are over 4 billion people on planet Earth that have weak or terrible infrastructure. There are if you combine it, there are 6.6 billion people on the planet who have less than $25,000 a year or lack of good infrastructure of GDP per capita. Hence, if you're in a global industry and you want to go after 6.6 billion people, you better think about your billion-dollar bets wisely. So that is it. I know I zoomed through that very quickly, but hopefully that was a good framework to have a great discussion. We're very excited about this opportunity, and I think our esteemed panelists will make some sense out of these billion-dollar bets. So with that, I want to introduce, and I'll have them introduce themselves. Maybe I'll start off with Professor Christopher Thomas. Maybe you'll go first, and then I'll start off actually with a question for you. We have Darren Gifford, and then I'm going to go to Sven. You have 31 patents. You'll tell about your background on this. Tell us about yourself, and why are you excited or not excited about this new powertrain future? Give you a softball first.
Sure. So just to give you some background, so first of all, thanks for having me here today. It's an honor and a pleasure. So yeah, I've spent my whole career in propulsion systems. I spent 20 years at an automaker, which was Chrysler, then Daimler Chrysler, and then Fiat Chrysler at the end. But spent a lot of time with the Mercedes guys, and pretty much everything I've done through my whole career was focusing on fuel economy, performance, and emissions. And actually in electrification, it's really focusing more on efficiency. So I spent 7 years at Borg Warner, where I was the chief technology officer. And I had my own consulting company for the last 3.5 years. And I've got a few large electric vehicle companies that I'm on retainer for, as well as some, I would say, electric vehicle suppliers. So I think I'm one of the few that's made the transition from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. So some would say I can give a balanced view. I would say I can argue either side of the page. So your question again was?
So my question is, now with that great background, how do you feel about, I mean, this is a global industry, and give me your optimistic, just a short optimistic view of this taking off, and argue briefly, very briefly, the key issues you see on this risk of this that I tried to lay out both sides myself, but give us your high level view real quick. We're going to go in much more depth.
Sure. So I think that the whole concept of a mosaic is exactly how it's going to be. You're going to see mild hybrids. I think the traditional internal combustion engines surviving as it has in the past is not going to happen. It's going to transition. The minimum will be mild hybrids. I think you're going to then see a good portion being plug-in hybrids. I don't think you're really going to see full hybrids. They're going to get squeezed out on the cost effectiveness by the mild hybrids, and on the regulatory side, just by the way the fuel economy games are played, or the regulations are written, the full hybrids are really going to, or the plug-in hybrids get twice as much benefit. They don't cost that much more. So again, from a value standpoint, they're going to really increase dramatically. And then you're going to have the battery electric vehicles, as you mentioned. And those are going to be, I think, the four big topics of big categories. There will be some small numbers of hydrogen as well, but that's the chicken and egg thing between infrastructure and the vehicles, right? I think your comment on the infrastructure for electricity is exactly right on. Half the houses in the US only have 60 amp service, which is about 7 kilowatts of power. So if you're trying to charge your vehicle overnight, you can't run your air conditioning or cook. That's
well, hold on that one. Well, I want to go a little more deep in that infrastructure. We'll go more. That's a great lead-in, Professor. If you'll forgive me here, but that was perfect, actually. I want to go next, Sven. From Silicon Valley, hell, they've started, you probably have 3 battery electric vehicles in your home. I'm just kidding.
Well, definitely outside my house, and I don't claim to own all of them, but well, I definitely see them all the way around. And actually, it's also interesting here in Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, where I am, to see more and more of the Ford Mach-E these days. And so some people say we are the, I don't know, breeding place for the electrification. Maybe some of it is true, But definitely a lot of things are happening here. A little bit about my background, since I think we are supposed to introduce us. The accent is German. I'm a German automotive engineer. My background is actually in chassis control system and vehicle dynamics control system. Started my career at BMW in the mid-1990s. And actually, quite frankly, powertrain was never that important to me. Powertrain did matter to build up enough momentum to have enough fun in the next turn. So that's basically how I started to look at it. But then once we got into vehicle dynamics control systems, so it really became something to control powertrain and steering and brakes and all of that at the same time. So that really became a vehicle motion. And that's still what gets me excited today. But fast forward with BMW, I got to Silicon Valley in the early 2000s. Like every other car company, BMW obviously has a Silicon Valley presence, trend scouting, technology, research. Did that, then moved over to Stanford University, where I still hold a lecturer appointment today. Back then, in the late 2000s, we started the Center for Automotive Research at Stanford, which was a lot about automated or autonomous driving, something that I still touch a lot on today. But already back then, around 2010, I said in that program, automation is very important, but let's also look at electrification and connectivity and sharing. So ACEs or CASE or whatever you want to call these topics are very dear to my heart. And that's what I do today in my independent consulting, Silicon Valley Mobility. So that's my little firm. I did learn consulting, not at KPMG, Gary, but at McKinsey. So after Stanford, I spent 2.5 years at McKinsey to learn the ropes in consulting. And what I do today is really looking at ACEs or CASE, whatever you want to call, automation, connectivity, electrification, sharing, at the intersection of business and technology. And that really what I find exciting about electrification today. I mean, on a personal note, I fundamentally believe it's going to help us with the climate change challenge that we have, and that electrification will be a big part of mitigating that. And but also how in electrification really policy and environment, but also technology. I mean, this is amazing technology. These vehicles are fun to drive, and believe me, you can build up enough momentum to really have a lot of fun in the next curve, but only on a close course and professional driver. I'm a professional driver, so that's good.
Oh, I didn't know that, Sven.
Well, look, I got all the BMW performance driving training, right? I mean, in South Carolina, actually, Gary, where we met last time.
I've been in that plant in South Carolina.
Exactly.
I went after lunch. That was a mistake, but sorry.
I got my training there, and actually in Northern Michigan as well, to do the low friction training. And all these things coming together, that's what gets me excited about electrification. And then obviously the consumer. How do you convince consumers to
well, I want to talk about that issue, but I'm going to cut you off here, but we're going to talk about that too. So fantastic background. I should call you Professor Sven too. So there you go.
Call me Sven, that's enough.
Now to Detroit. Let's go to my good friend Darren Gifford from Detroit. Give us your background. I know you are a colleague of mine at KPMG. Yeah, so delighted to see your smiling face again. And I'm sure in Detroit, there is a different perspective in the world too, or you can give us your background and then a quick high-level perspective, and then we'll go deep.
Well, there have been different perspectives from Detroit. I think it's starting to shift and change, although I think there's a lot of tradition.
Oh, you're mute, Dan.
Yeah,
clicked by accident. So it's starting to change. It's starting to change with some time as the tradition of ICEs is going away. But I have to get background-wise. I've been in the auto industry for over 40 years. So I actually started in the industry working on internal combustion engines, primarily diesels. I'm actually a certified diesel mechanic, so more of a getting your hands dirty standpoint. So it's been quite a dramatic change for me to look at electric over the 40 years. I started working with electric, with lithium-ion cells and materials back in the 80s. And then starting in 2009, I started working with the Department of Energy. And so I was involved, we were involved with what's called the loan program at that point. So we had a chance to work with a number of startups, including Tesla, before the Model S was actually approved and moving forward. We worked worked with Fisker in those days, which has now become Karma. We've worked with, there's several dozen other startups that actually have come and gone. So it's back to the bets, because a startup doesn't typically make $1 billion bet, and it takes that much to actually start up a vehicle, at least anyway, because there's many components, not just the powertrain, to worry about. At Plant Moran, I lead our strategy consulting group, as well as our automotive industry vertical. And our research team at Plant Moran actually has been very active working on forecasting models with our clients, both I'd say primarily suppliers that are trying to figure out this transition, as well as many startup OEMs and some of the larger OEMs as well, but looking at the modeling for what drives changes in the electric vehicle marketplace, and including things like cost parity, which we'll talk about, I think, between gasoline engines and electric. Cost of batteries is coming down dramatically, but what's that mean to the overall vehicle itself? But we also consider some new factors coming on board as well, such as assisted driving or autonomous or sharing. And our models actually go out to 2050. So it's quite interesting to take it out that far in a non-linear type of a modeling algorithm.
I can tell you humility, I won't let you go over the models yet, but you can give us the insight in a second. But I can tell you humility is in order when forecasting such an uncertain environment. So let's go. This is fantastic. We've got, I think, a really great path. So let's start off with the consumer. I tend to think, this is my bias, we have a lot of regulatory people, we have a lot of technology people, but ultimately at the end of the day, you can't make people buy these cars. So you got to have a consumer focus. So just for this webcast, let's just stay in the US market, because the rest of the globe is too complex and they have different regulatory environments and incentives. So let's just stay in the US for a moment. I showed a graphic up there where most of the new sexy cool vehicles are essentially 45 to 50,000 and above. And that's where it's going to be, at least for the next X number of years. So where do you think consumers, what is it about it that will make consumers choose and want to do this? Is there an awareness issue? Is it chicken and the egg issue? Are you concerned about there are too many players going after too few consumers, especially at the high end? I'll start maybe, Sven, with you. You live in a very wealthy area of the world per capita. I think there's a huge bias towards these vehicles. They love them, but they're very expensive. Maybe give us your perspective, and we'll go around the horn on the consumer side.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm still thinking back to the days, I think it was in 2006 or something like this, when I actually lived outside Detroit working with BMW, GM, and Daimler Chrysler on hybrid powertrains. And when I was visiting my friends in Silicon Valley back then, it was quite something to see all these Toyota Priuses or Prii. I'm not sure what the plural actually ended up being. And that I even could take a picture of 3 Toyota Priuses in one shot. That was quite something back then. And today, I mean, you can easily take a picture of 4 or 5 Teslas in one shot. And again, the Mach-E is getting in there as well. You still see a few Nissan Leafs here and there, and you see a Chevy Bolt a little bit. I'm anxious to see from my home country a VW ID4 or something like that coming here. So you see them all over, and at some point, maybe it was like 5 years ago, it becomes a blur. People called the Tesla Model S the Silicon Valley Toyota Camry equivalent, right? Where you see a Toyota Camry all over the place in other parts, which actually you see quite some of them around here as well. And the Tesla Model S was the one. And I mean, remains to be seen. I don't really know what the market share of battery electric vehicles in Silicon Valley is. I'm guessing it might be, let's say 20%, give or take. It's not 80 and certainly not 100%, right? I mean, people are still buying, let's say, a Land Rover or Range Rover for that matter, or they still buy, from my colleagues, the BMW X5M. I mean, it's not really an electrified vehicle in that sense. It might have 42 volts in there, but you get the point. So Gary, what does it take from a consumer perspective? And for the longest time, the statistics were it's the range of the vehicle. I think we got the range mostly fixed. So now that we're getting well beyond 250, 300 mile on one charge, I think that's fixed. Then charging opportunities still, well, and this is where psychology starts to get in. I mean, with range as well, it's also psychological. But with charging, so much of the charging happens at home, but then it becomes a city dweller versus like the suburbs where you charge outside your house. So I think this is where people, which actually means all of us, need to see how do we actually manage our lives with these kind of vehicles. We always go back to these smartphone examples, like in the early 2000s, a cell phone lasted 1 week without a charge. And today you're lucky if your iPhone that's 2 years old lasts for 2 hours. So you get the point what we manage, and that's the same with charging. And the other one certainly is cost. And that's where you showed this graph, Gary. I think that's a very powerful one, that it's really the upper third or something like this, where all the new vehicles are coming out. And there, I also want to remind everyone, it's not a black or white thing. It's not like, oh, not everybody can afford this car. But I think these vehicles make a point, because let's say the General Motors EV1 also made a point, but it was not an aspirational vehicle, right? And in a way, it's somewhat similar to motorsports. Let's say Formula One. I'm saying this as a European. Like in motorsports, Formula One, nobody buys a Formula One vehicle, really, right? But because these things exist, it becomes aspirational. I want to get something like this. And maybe if you see a Porsche Taycan or Tesla Model S or Fisker Pacific or Ocean very soon, you might say, well, one day I'm going to get one of those. But for now, I stick with a Chevy Bolt or something like that. So there you have it. That's my point about the consumer.
Yeah, interesting. And you were in it's great to hear that, because you're in really the heart of electric world to have that variability in the thinking on that. That's fascinating. Professor Chris, you tell us your thinking in this area on those pesky consumers.
I think Sven has it right. It's that the range anxiety issue has got to be overcome before there'll be mass adoption. If you look back, the Nissan Leaf had 72 miles of range when it was fully charged. That's like leaving your house with the check gas light on, or the refill your gas tank when it's full, right? That's the equivalent. So, but now, as Sven said, we're at 300 or 400 miles on some of these vehicles. But that's from a full charge. I think one of my colleagues was driving an I-Pace, and he was going up to one of the battery consortiums in Wisconsin, driving from Detroit, and he basically realized that he couldn't make it, even though there were enough charging stations and the range of the I-Pace. The problem was he'd have to do a full charge, and the 80% charge is where the fast time is. That last 20% takes almost as long as the first 80. So you end up having to stop every hour and a half for an hour. And that's just not practical. So fast charging, I think, is going to be the other one when we're going to 800 and 900 volts. There's quite a few automakers that are looking at 900, 925 volt systems. But I think the range is the big thing. But the other thing is the fun to drive, right? These vehicles, as we were kind of mentioning, some of the Teslas do, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. But boy, these vehicles are extremely fast, they're extremely quick, and they're really like driving almost like a slot car, right? You hit the accelerator and they go. They do miss a little bit of that. In the internal combustion engine, we call it the blowdown interference of the exhaust, but that gives you that burble sound of the V8 that's kind of intoxicating, but you can pipe the music in and have it do that. So I think
software, right?
It's going to come down to those couple things. It's some of the fast charge infrastructure, overcoming any range anxiety. But these vehicles are fun to drive, and that's what's selling them. And if you listen to Elon Musk talk about it, he says, he didn't do electric vehicles to be, so environmental. It was all about they're the quickest accelerating things, and that's why he wanted it. So, anyway.
It's interesting you say that, because, and both of you have said this, the in our paper, and I recently gave a talk on this, if you look at the two worlds of what the Nissan Leaf did and Tesla and just their approaches, I think that is a fundamental important topic, because when I talk about place your billion-dollar bets wisely in this ambiguity, I don't know the numbers. They don't publish the numbers. It's not like they raise your hand and say, we just blew at least, but I've heard it's 5, 6, at least billions of dollars that Nissan had spent at least developing the Leaf. And they basically gave money away for everyone they sold, or they had to get some subsidy, and they still lost money, and it wasn't aspirational. That's why I'm not arguing that's why they are in the position they are today, but certainly in a capital intensive industry, getting these bets, even if you got the vision right, if you get the timing wrong, these consumers don't want this at this time, or they didn't want that type. I mean, this is why this is such a risky proposition with the range and aspirational. So I think both your points are just spot on this. I think they're excellent points.
And along those points, Gary, you got to remember that Tesla's still making money because of the EV credits that they sell to Stellantis and to GM, right? And so you've got Dodge Ram pickups and Silverados that are really subsidizing the Tesla Model 3. So if you go 100%, there's nobody left to subsidize.
There you go. Well, if they're all got these now, maybe that's why they joined. So, Adair, what about you? These are sexy and fun to drive, but they are these, the big part of the market. What's your thoughts on the consumer side and what they're thinking, especially in the Midwest, in Detroit, or just even in the Midwest where the people have longer distances? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think the Midwest is always a follower, but I think they are fun to drive. But we don't think that's really the driver of consumer adoption. I think some of this is going to come down to infrastructure, because the challenge is always how many charging stations, how fast is the charge, how do you get from point to point, and as you said, some of that is just within the energy infrastructure. The last leg is the problem, down to the house level, or even out to the apartment complex if you're downtown. And we've seen studies from China that indicate that actually that the key driver for growth in EVs there was actually number one was actually infrastructure availability, and number two were the incentives we hear about in China on the vehicles. But the other part then on the incentive side, we believe, and we've proven this out in some of our forecasting and modeling with clients, is the cost. And so the closer you get to cost parity, then the consumers flip over, because at that point it's kind of like anything else. Is that why would I pay the same amount of money or even close to it for old technology, for the old stuff, when I can have the new technology? And so as battery costs come down, but also not just battery costs, but the other parts of the drivetrain are critical on an electric vehicle, because it's not, batteries create an electrochemical reaction that has to get translated then, through the DC-DC converter and the inverters down into mechanical form at the traction motor out to the wheels. And Tesla does it with performance, because then they put two motors out there that drive all four wheels really fast, right? The ICE drivetrain has to do the same thing, only they're starting from an internal combustion engine through the transmission to the drive shafts out to the wheels. The cost of that is going to go up over time. And probably through government pressure, it'll go up, but also through lower volumes. The cost of some of those components may not stay as low as they are. So the two of those forces converge, we think, somewhere here in the late 20s, between 25 and 30, depending upon where you want to make your assumptions in there. And then you see a major transition, kind of that inflection point that we talk about sometimes, where consumers really flip over.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so that's going to be a market pressure thing.
Yeah, getting it. All right, well, let's talk about that. Thanks, Darren. Let's talk about physics and the gasoline and the internal combustion engine is essentially just heuristically a gas of a full tank of gas is the equivalent to 1,000 sticks of dynamite. It won for a reason. I don't want to be dark, but 9/11, what did they do to blow up the tower, right? They put gasoline, which is energy density, and blew up, you can blow up a building doing this. The energy density is incredible. And it starts with a huge advantage. Batteries are chemistry right now. There are chemistry. And the complexity of this. So there's been billions of bets in this area. And I'll start with you, Professor. On the cost, you've got the internal combustion engine, its advantages with the physics and its improvement over time, but you have massive bets and great improvements over time in this parity that Darren talked about, for, cost per kilowatt hour. How should we think about this market on the parity? Is there going to be parity soon? When do you think? What does that parity look like? What are the ambiguities? There's this little problem called lithium and getting it. There's this aluminum issue and skyrocketing costs are in weird parts of the world. I mean, this is not a magical supply chain that makes all this, huff and puff over time. So enlighten us, sir.
Okay, so I think there's a couple things in there. When we start talking about the scarcity of lithium, I think there's a scarcity in the supply chain, right, of actually getting it out of the ground and having enough. But I think markets tend to solve those problems over time. I think the bigger problem is probably in the cobalt. Cobalt's used in the anode, and the cobalt, 59% of it comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has inhumane mining practices and has Amnesty International wanting to shut the mines down. They have 35% child labor. So clearly there's a big issue there. Most of the automakers like Tesla, Daimler, Renault have all come out and said they will not use DRC cobalt. The next biggest manufacturer of cobalt is Russia, and we have an embargo against them, so you can't use that either. So 2/3 of the world's cobalt is gone. Now, the good news is everyone's working on new battery chemistry to eliminate cobalt, and actually CATL has launched some. They're inherently less energy dense, which means you can't get as many kilowatt hours in the same size of battery pack. And also they've been a little bit more temperamental in their chemistry, and that's in Detroit they call it significant thermal events. So
we call those fires. Yes,
we call them fires out west, I guess. But anyway, I think those are some fundamental things in the physics. But the battery chemistries are getting better. People are talking about solid state batteries. They're coming. They're not going to be coming that quickly. When your question though is all around the cost parity, right? It's the big thing is, where are you drawing your control volume, and are you including the cost of gasoline over the life of the vehicle and cost of electricity? As we all know, gasoline is basically, here in the US, is basically a third tax. In Europe, it ends up being 80 or 90% tax, depending on the country. So is that really a fair comparison? And how are you going to replace those tax revenues, especially in Europe? That's a problem. But if you're including the cost of running the vehicles, we've seen this before, where if you offered a consumer a vehicle that gets better fuel economy, but they have to pay something up front for it, generally they're not willing to pay for it, right? Right. And so I think that's going to be a losing proposition to say that, hey, over the life of the vehicle, you'll break even. Or you have 50,000 miles to break even. They're not going to do that. You've got to get the cost parity down to the sales price, the sticker price going out of the showroom, or the online store, whatever it will be in the future, right? But that's where we've got to get to, and I think that's not going to be until the mid-2030s.
Mid-2030s, okay.
Especially when you're talking about the high volume consumer vehicles, which are those Toyota Camrys or Honda Accords, or the D segment sedan, I would say.
I'm going to go to you, Sven, in a second on this, but could you spend a moment? In our paper where we talked about the mosaic, which we talked about earlier, Professor, on the hydrogen fuel cells, and I know Daimler spent billions, Toyota has spent billions, Hyundai has spent billions and have success. So they're niche and very great applications for hydrogen fuel cells. Can you just, high level, you don't have to give a dissertation, but what's your thoughts on hydrogen?
So I think hydrogen's going to have its place. I think it's going to be generally in the larger vehicles. So I think semis, the Class 8 tractor trailers, are the natural place buses, these bigger vehicles where the battery pack would just have to be so large and recharging it takes too long. Whereas a hydrogen refilling can be done in about the same amount of time as filling a tank of diesel, right? So I think that's naturally where they're going to be. Also, the cost of a fuel cell, they're expensive, right? There's a lot of platinum and other precious metals in there. They're probably not going to come down as much, but you in a big vehicle, you can probably absorb some of that cost, right? More than you can in the small C segment, Ford Focus or the small vehicles. So,
yeah, in the amortization of the cost, I think that's to be figured out. I agree with that. We actually, yeah.
But I think the key point is in commercial vehicles, fleet owners do look at total cost of ownership. And I mentioned that private consumers generally don't. Fleet owners do. Fleet owners definitely do.
Absolutely.
And so well, if they're looking at the cost of a battery electric vehicle versus a fuel cell in a Class 8 tractor trailer, it may be more advantageous than you think on the hydrogen. It may not be as bad just because you need a megawatt of battery, right?
You're making me smile because if you look at, not to be self-serving, but if you look at our paper and how we lay out the mosaic, that's exactly how we look at it. We look at the specific mission and how you think about that in there. So you're spot on in our view, by the way.
Well, that's because physics are the same, right?
Yes, exactly. So although you got to get that, it's only one of those hydrogen. And by the way, well, we can talk about hydrogen. Sven, you spent a lot of time thinking about this topic too, just on the cost parity and innovation, Silicon Valley. I think humility is also in order as we, there's this thing called computing power that continues to get better. And we learn, I'm not saying we're going to be in the quantum world anytime soon, but we're learning about new materials, new innovations that can bring costs down a lot faster than we literally think through. So I really think humility and in fact, it's exciting for me. But anyhow, your thoughts on parity and on battery electric and your thoughts.
So I would say that cost parity between a combustion engine powered vehicle and a battery electric vehicle, I would still see this in the 2020s. Whether that's 2025 or more towards 2030 remains to be seen. And there's not just this one vehicle, it's obviously always a range. But I would see that in the mid to later part of this current decade that we see a cost parity from a purchase standpoint. Operation, as Chris also pointed out, is certainly very different, but individual consumers don't look that much at how much does it cost me per year to run this vehicle. So that's gonna happen. And how that cost is going to come down. I mean, we used to say that for a battery electric vehicle, the battery is about 50% of the purchase price of the vehicle. I'm not sure if that still holds true as battery prices coming down. If we're at 40% or something like this, but obviously it needs to come down even further. And what's in there, recently I published a little bit of my research, and I talked about Moore's Law and Wright's Law. And Moore's Law, probably everybody's familiar with. That's from the compute industry and what you, in a way, are also referring to. And there's exponential growth that for microprocessors, there's like the doubling of transistors every 2 years, more or less since the 1960s, give or take. Maybe it slows down, but does that apply to batteries as well? Well, it does apply to battery energy density, but not with the same factor as microprocessors, where you have a doubling every 2 years for microprocessors. You have a doubling in energy density every 10 years for batteries. So that's good news. And if you look at Tesla's specs, they actually follow that law more or less. Now, pricing or cost is Wright's law, which one can look up. Wright was an aerospace engineer in the 1930s and whatever, and he did all of it. Gary, our friends, not at KPMG, not at McKinsey, but at BCG, are actually using the Wright's law quite a bit. And they find that the cost comes down the more units are being produced. So the more we produce, the more we learn, the better we get at these processes.
Yeah.
Now, the question then there is battery manufacturing a labor-intensive product? And what my research found, and as much as I could find, They're in the order of 15%. 15% is like really process manufacturing and labor. And that comes down, but the rest is really material costs. And this is what Chris alluded to, where you also talked about it, Gary, that might there be a fight over cobalt? Might there be a fight over other precious materials? That remains to be seen, but it looks like where we are now, give or take $130, $150 per kilowatt hour. Depends who you ask, and if you look at the cell or at the pack level, that we get into the $50 to $70 per kilowatt hour range, probably at the end of the 2020s. And that definitely means cost parity.
Interesting. All right, that's very good. I'm going to shift and I'm going to go to you, Darren. I'm going to shift topics. I think there's a lot of, this is an exciting area to watch, obviously, on the cost parity on this and breakthroughs. Humility, I always say, is in order in these areas, because of just, you can have game-changing technologies out of the blue that no one saw, or it doesn't happen, right? And everything in between. But let's switch to suppliers, Darren. And I know Chris has worked at BorgWarner for many years. So I argued, and not argued, I showed mathematically that, and you're working a lot with the supplier network you were talking about. If you were to take 30% BEV globally penetration, which I don't know if that's a good or bad number, but just let's take it as a number by 2030, and you would apply that back to today's internal combustion capacity globally, that would imply 40 million excess capacity, approximately, a little less than that, of internal combustion engines, which is massive. That's the equivalent to 200 assembly plants shutting down. And that doesn't even count the multiplier effect of all the suppliers. Even if it's 15%, it's a massive number. Or if you're a supplier, Darren, and you're focused in the historically over the last 80, 100, whatever years in the internal combustion engine, and you're about to lose your scale of 10, 15, 20, 30% of your volume over time is going to go down. You just don't know when. What the hell are you going to do about it? How should you think about it? And give us especially in Detroit and even globally for that matter, the suppliers have got to be really thinking about this.
Well, suppliers are very worried about it. And it's been I think it's become readily apparent the last 2 or 3 years, where we were talking about this 10 years ago, and there was a lot more skepticism. And this is a pie in the sky. I think you mentioned earlier about Tesla being viewed negatively in those days. I would say if you go back to looking at production, there's more to the vehicle than just the powertrain. And so those 200 assembly plants you're talking about, those are assembling vehicles, and so the powertrain is only a part of that. Maybe it's a big part now with the engine and transmission and the like, but you still have to make a vehicle that a consumer can use or a commercial customer can use. It still has to have the chassis. I think it's Sven started there, right? So everything has to be hooked up to something like that. You have to have body panels. There's a frame, especially around the battery electric vehicles. It has to go into place. You have wheels, drive shafts potentially, unless it's an in-wheel motor. But axles, you've got lights, interiors will still have to be there for a nice trim package, steering wheels, brakes. So we're only talking about one part of the vehicle. Now it's the big part. So don't want to discount that. So from a supplier standpoint, if you're making interior trim, it's not a big deal. Now, if you go to more autonomous and self-driving vehicles in the future, maybe it's a bigger deal, right? But that's a different technology, not the electric side of things. So those assembly plants will need to convert over, either close or convert, because somebody still has to make the vehicles. Someone still has to assemble the vehicles, run them down through body and paint, run down the assembly line, put all those pieces together, test them, make sure they get out to the consumer. As a supplier looking at that, then the challenge is, if I'm making connecting rods for an internal combustion engine, and that's my specialty, I do have a problem, because my volumes will go down in the future, and it's a matter of trying to predict when. And so what we've done with most of our suppliers in those kind of environments said to take a step back and look at what you're making, because even if you try and monetize your business today, the potential buyers, and there's a lot of private equity folks on this call.
We call efficient, right? It might price that in at some level, yeah.
Well, exactly, yeah. So you're going to go in, Gary, you guys would do it, we would do it. Go in, if you look at the value of the company, you're kind of like, well, great, nice track record the last 5 years. What the next 5 look like? Well, if it's going to go down, that's not so good. So you have to figure out how to reposition yourself. What are your core competencies? How do you what do you make in the future that's different, right? Using the same skills you've got today. And so that's really a lot of the transition strategy we try and work on and talk about with suppliers.
No, great points. And I think, Chris, you worked at BorgWarner for many years, and obviously they've pivoted. They recently bought Delphi. This is all public information, but arguably what they said publicly is correct. You know, they're getting scale.
I
right?
think the strategy we put together at BorgWarner, and you know, sometimes these things are driven by the outside. You know, we were doing the analysis internally and built our models and showed that electrification had to come to meet the CO2 and fuel economy standards globally. But it wasn't until a buy-side advisor in an investor relations meeting said, your terminal value is 0 because when electric vehicles come, you'll be out of business, right? So BorgWarner is the world's largest turbocharger manufacturer. They make 120 miles of timing chain every day. They make all of the 50% of the world's friction material in automatic transmissions. They make all of these high-tech parts that go into the powertrains. And so how do you pivot to get into some of these other things? And it comes down to exactly what Darren said about core competencies. And so we went out and acquired Remy Electric Motors. Yeah, they had an ongoing business of starters and alternators, but it was really about getting that hybrid motor and EV motor capability. And you pair that with the power electronics that's with the Sevcon acquisition, and now with the Delphi acquisition, with the gearbox capability that BorgWarner already had, because that looks a lot like a transfer case, and the world's largest transfer case manufacturer for pickup trucks. So you can pivot a lot of those capabilities.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, right? And you can just get. I think our punchline on this, listening to both of you, is that you have to have a new strategy to place your bets. So it could be mergers, or it could be acquisitions. You could get scale, you could pivot. By the way, the OEMs better think about this too, because they're going to have this business going forward. And some of these suppliers could tip into bankruptcy. They may need help, or they may need, so this is, I think the supplier side is going to be a fascinating story going forward on that. So I agree with both of you. We're down to 6 minutes, and I'm having way too much fun. I wish we could go over here, but let's take the last topic. Well, I guess we'll have to go quickly. And this is more global, and so I don't know how we should think about this. But then there's the regulatory complexity, and then you have government subsidies, and even the Biden administration's recently announced a lot of investments, or at least they're trying to, in this industry. You see it in China, but when China stopped, people stopped buying it. Europe's going big, and it's all over the map. I mean, and I'll make one last comment, then I'll hand it over to you guys to think about it. The other thing is we talk about not thinking linearly in technology and humility there. I think we all need to also not think that way in terms of regulation and governments. You know, no one saw the 2016 election. I doubt anybody figured out who was going to win the 2020, or we knew there was even going to be a pandemic, right? Who the hell saw that coming? No one. So what's going to happen in 2024, let alone what's going to happen in 2022 or 2028 politically? We could flip back, and you got to have humility in terms of the world. And that is not a value judgment on the trajectory of this. It's just politics and the world we live in. And we have to be open to that. And as such, the regulatory environment may whip back and forth, and even globally for that matter. So how should we think about subsidies? How should we think about the variability in regulation when you're in a global industry and you're placing these billion-dollar bets? So maybe open up, maybe Sven, your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, let's see what I can add to this question. And look, it's really exactly as you say, Gary. It's not really that predictable. And in a way, you can say you might want to milk the cow as long as it gives milk, and then you might need to go to other livestock and see if you get anything out of it. jokingly, obviously, but not entirely, because we obviously saw those $7,500 subsidies for electric vehicles, and then they might be phased out or maybe not. China was also a big deal. I actually lost track of it. Was it like the beginning of 2020 or already beginning of 2019?
Yeah, and then they stopped because they ran out of money, and then
but that does not necessarily mean that then governments completely stop from giving out tax breaks, subsidies, or whatever, because also the government obviously needs to manage different things, and there's the environmental aspects, and hopefully they take them to heart. Then there's the consumer, to keep the consumer happy and to encourage the consumer to do the right thing, whatever the right thing is. But then there's also jobs, right? And to actually support a certain industry. And the automotive industry is obviously still growing last time I checked in China, and they want to make it a very important part of their economy. My home country, Germany, I mean, wouldn't be what it is without automotive industry. And so therefore, I fundamentally believe to really, in the end, get over the hump. And I think we are at the hump, but to get over the hump with consumer adoption regarding electric vehicles, government subsidies, maybe mandates are necessary. And mandates then is always like, oh my God, that's a pretty tough thing to think about mandates. But let's don't forget, we are not just talking about things on a national level or on a state level. For instance, here in California, obviously also Governor Newsom said how many electric vehicles we want to have by 2035 and all of that. But also on a city level, it might be something you're not getting into the city anymore if it's not a battery electric vehicle. So Gary,
wow,
one thing comes to my mind. It's some sort of like
you got governments, you got cities. Oh my God, this is hard.
So what comes to my mind, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but place your bets wisely. I think
what a brilliant man! What a brilliant man! All right, we're down to 1 minute here. I want to be cognizant. Do people on the can people ask questions on this, Yvonne, or we? Should I all right, I give you a whopping minute, everybody. So maybe
just unmute yourself if you have a question.
If people have questions, maybe.
Oh, wow, that's dangerous.
Yeah, I know, right? With all these brilliant minds here, you don't have to. I mean, I want to be respectful of people's time here. So any quick questions from the group here? All right. Well, I want to thank this esteemed panel. Man, this was an hour that flew by. I got to say, you guys were fantastic. I learned a lot. It was great to hear your points of view and a lot of confirmation of thinking here, which makes me feel good. And hopefully that's not my confirmation bias, Professor Kahneman, who taught me that. But brilliant, fun, and on behalf of KPMG and on everybody here, and I want to just thank ACG Silicon Valley and Detroit. This has been terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gary. And thanks for the wonderful panel. Definitely super interesting discussion. And we hope to see you again soon. Check back in and happy Tuesday. Bye.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Bye-bye.